There are humans living on every single landmass on Earth, from the frozen edges of the Arctic to the remote islands of the Pacific, from the dense jungles of South America to the dry interior of Australia. Humans got there. All of them. Tens of thousands of years before the compass was invented, before maps existed, before anyone had a boat with a sail, before there was even a word for the concept of navigation. Somehow ancient humans crossed thousands of miles of open ocean, walked through some of the most hostile environments on the planet, survived conditions that would kill a modern person in days, and populated an entire world using nothing but their bodies, their brains, and whatever the earth around them could provide. This is not just a story about walking. This is one of the greatest journeys in the history of life on Earth, and most people have never heard the full version of it. The story starts in Africa roughly 70,000 years ago, though humans had already been living on the continent for well over 100,000 years before that. The first migration out of Africa was not a dramatic organized march. It was almost certainly a gradual accidental drift, small groups of people following animals, following water sources, following the seasons, slowly pushing the boundary of where they had been before. They were not thinking about populating a planet. They were thinking about finding food tomorrow. But step by step, generation by generation, those small pushes added up to something extraordinary. The first major route out of Africa went northeast through what is now the Sinai Peninsula and into the Middle East. This was not a dramatic crossing, it was essentially a land bridge. And groups of early humans almost certainly made it across without even realizing they had left one continent and entered another. From the Middle East, the spread continued in multiple directions. Some groups pushed east along the southern coastline of Asia, following the shoreline where food from the sea was reliable and the climate was relatively stable. This coastal route is one of the most important highways in human history that nobody ever talks about because much of it is now underwater. Sea levels were significantly lower during the last ice age, which means the coastline these people walked along is today sitting beneath the ocean. Taking almost all of its evidence with it, that coastal migration along southern Asia moved with extraordinary speed in evolutionary terms. Genetic and archaeological evidence suggests that modern humans reached what is now India roughly 60 to 65,000 years ago, and Southeast Asia not long after. The pace of this movement tells researchers something important. These people were not stumbling around randomly. They had knowledge. They could read animal behavior, seasonal plant cycles, weather patterns, and terrain in ways that have no modern equivalent. This was not guesswork. This was thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about how the natural world worked, passed down through generations by observation and storytelling, functioning as a navigation system more sophisticated than anything they could have built from scratch now. Here is where the journey gets genuinely mind-bending. Getting from Africa to continental Asia, while impressive, can be explained by land movement and low sea levels creating accessible crossings. But Australia is different. Even during the last ice age, when sea levels were at their lowest and land bridges connected many currently separated landmasses, Australia was still separated from the nearest landmass by at least 70 to 90 kilometres of open ocean. There was no way to walk there. And yet, humans arrived in Australia at least 65,000 years ago, possibly earlier. That means ancient humans built watercraft capable of crossing open ocean tens of thousands of years before the oldest known boats in the archaeological record. We have almost no physical evidence of those boats because wood and reed do not survive that long, but the humans in Australia are their own proof. Getting there required intentional sea crossing. It required boats. It required navigation across open water with no visible destination. It is one of the most extraordinary achievements in all of human history, and it happened so long ago that most of us have never even heard of it. Getting to Europe and Central Asia from the Middle East was comparatively straightforward, but surviving there was another matter entirely. The humans who pushed north and west into what is now Europe were walking into conditions that were brutally cold, dominated by glaciers and populated by animals like woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, cave lions, and cave bears predators and competitors that made every day genuinely dangerous. And yet they not only survived, they thrived. They developed more sophisticated tools to hunt larger animals. They made clothing from animal hides to survive the cold. They built shelters from mammoth bones and tusks when wood was scarce. They painted the walls of caves with images of the animals around them in a way that suggests a level of symbolic thinking, forward planning, and social communication that was already remarkably advanced. Surviving in Ice Age Europe was not just physical endurance, it required culture, coordination, and intelligence operating at a high level. The crossing into the Americas is perhaps the most debated chapter of this entire story. The most widely accepted route involves a land bridge called Beringia, a vast stretch of land that connected what is now Siberia to Alaska during the last ice age when sea levels were low enough to expose the floor of the Bering Strait. Humans crossed this bridge on foot, following herds of large animals eastward, and from Alaska they spread south through North America, and eventually all the way to the southern tip of South America, in an expansion that covered roughly 15,000 kilometers of entirely new territory. What makes this breathtaking is the speed. Genetic and archaeological evidence suggests the entire length of the Americas, from Alaska to Patagonia, may have been populated in as little as a few thousand years. That is not slow drift. That is purposeful, rapid, organized movement across terrain that had never seen a human footprint before. But the Americas migration gets even more complicated. There is growing evidence that some groups may have also reached the Americas by boat, traveling along the Pacific coastline in small watercraft rather than walking the interior. And even more controversially, some researchers now believe there may have been earlier arrivals in the Americas before the Beringia crossing, possibly from across the Pacific, based on genetic traces in certain South American populations that appear to connect to ancient populations from Australia and Polynesia. The full story of how humans reached the Americas may involve multiple routes, multiple waves and crossings that seem almost impossible given the technology available at the time. The more researchers look, the more complex and surprising the picture becomes. And then there is the Pacific. The last great chapter of human migration happened relatively recently, beginning roughly 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, when a remarkable seafaring culture known today as the Austronesians began spreading across the Pacific Ocean in canoes. These were not accidental voyages. The Polynesians and their ancestors navigated thousands of miles of open ocean using the stars, the swell patterns of waves, the flight paths of birds, cloud formations over unseen islands, and an accumulated knowledge of the sea so precise that modern researchers have spent decades trying to fully reconstruct it. They found tiny islands scattered across an ocean larger than all the world's land masses combined. They settled Hawaii, Easter Island, New Zealand, and hundreds of islands in between. They did this in wooden canoes, without instruments, without charts, without anything we would recognize as technology, using only a reading of the natural world that was passed from navigator to navigator across generations as an oral tradition. It remains one of the most stunning navigational achievements in all of human existence. So when you add it all up, what ancient humans accomplished in terms of travel and migration is almost beyond comprehension. From a single origin point in Africa, they walked, sailed, and waded into every corner of a planet that had no roads, no maps, no supply lines, and no guarantees of survival. They crossed frozen land bridges in the dark of Ice Age winters. They built boats to cross open ocean before boats were supposed to exist. They read the stars and the waves and the birds to find islands invisible over the horizon. They did all of this driven by nothing more than curiosity, necessity, and the fundamental human refusal to stay where they were when something unknown existed just beyond the next ridge. We tend to think of ancient humans as primitive. The distance they travelled and the intelligence required to survive every mile of it suggests something very different.